Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing? Look, a friend of mine, or one of my students, just sent me something, a video that he watched that was put on YouTube about 10, 15, 20 minutes ago. I'm not going to call the name because I don't do that type of stuff. But a prominent freight broker trainer in the industry was saying that, he was looking forward, or there was some concern about the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association reviewing the role of dispatchers and freight brokers. Okay, and he stated, pretty much what I've been, preaching and teaching in my online course and at my freight broker and dispatcher vocational school for years now, that dispatchers and freight brokers are not the same. Well, his stance was that, some dispatchers are operating as freight brokers. Okay, first of all, dispatchers who are operating legally do not operate as freight brokers, because there's clearly a defined difference between freight brokers and dispatchers. Now, what he was saying that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association is going to do a review, and they may have to clarify the role of dispatchers and freight brokers. Dispatchers, I don't think you all have to worry. The reason, and here's the reason why. Dispatchers have been operating for the last 30 plus years. Every 2 to 3 years, there's always some type of challenge to the legality of dispatching. Okay, and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association has ruled over the last 25 plus years on every challenge that dispatching is legal. That dispatchers are not paid the way freight brokers are. Here's the reason why freight brokers are need to have a bond, a need to have an authority, because they are going directly to shippers, and they get paid by the shipper. Now, freight brokers are supposed to negotiate a margin on top of the money that shippers have allocated to carriers. Let me repeat that. The way freight brokers are legally supposed to operate, they're supposed to be negotiating a margin on top of the money that is allocated by a shipper to be paid to carriers. In other words, freight brokers should not be touching the carrier's money. Why? Because the carrier's money is allocated for them to go out and hire bona fide agents, contract agents, dispatchers who sign a pre-existing agreement for continued service with that carrier. Those are the legal differences between a freight broker and a dispatcher. Dispatchers are paid by the carrier, so because they are a contracted agent of the carrier, they do not need an authority, because they do not operate independently without being contracted with the carrier. A freight broker can operate independently without being contracted with the carrier or any other entity. Therefore, they must have an authority. That is what they're going to clarify. Now, here is why freight brokers should be more worried about this upcoming review than dispatchers, and what he and other freight broker trainers are not telling you. They have been teaching freight brokers how to steal from owner-operators. Okay, I don't bite my tongue. I don't take it back, because it's true. If you are a freight broker and you were taught to go out to a shipper and get the loads that the shipper has, and whatever the money that the shipper has on those loads, then you can take those loads, and you can take, let's say a load is paying $3,000, you take $700 off that load and you post it for $2,300 instead of the full $3,000. Guess what? You are stealing. You are stealing. You are operating illegally. So brokers really should be worried, because what I suspect is going to happen is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association is going to clearly define how each of those two entities are supposed to operate, and how each of those two entities are supposed to get paid. Now, are there some dispatchers out there who operate illegally, like a freight broker? Yes, some dispatchers go directly to shippers and they try to negotiate rates, and you can't do that. You can't do that. A dispatcher cannot get a whole bunch of loads and then shotgun them out. Only a freight broker can do that. But the majority of dispatchers don't do that. The majority of dispatchers go directly to a carrier, they negotiate a fee under a contract, their dispatch agreement, that pre-existing agreement that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association talks about in the statute, 49 CFR 371, in the statute, the legal law, that has been the law of the land for the last 30 years. The majority of dispatchers, they operate that way. They get paid directly by the carrier for finding a carrier specific freight that they have designated or told the dispatcher what they want. They cannot just go out and grab a whole bunch of loads and then shotgun them over to the carrier. They can only look for freight that the carrier has specified that they want, the type of freight that they want. What kind of money they want to get paid, what type of freight it is, flatbed, dry van, reefer. I want freight that's coming out of this area, going to such and such place, or what it could be. It has to be very defined and specific, narrow search criteria. You can't just go out and get a whole bunch of loads and shotgun them out. Brokers can do that. That's why they can go to load boards and get their own load boards account and post thousands of loads on the load boards. That's the difference. Now, a lot of brokers are going to be hurt when they do come out with this finding. Because here's what's going to happen. Here's what I suspect. Because I don't think the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association is going to backtrack or contradict their last 30 years of ruling. Because every 2 years or so, there's a challenge to the legality of dispatching. And the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association has ruled exactly the same way for the last 30 years, that dispatching is legal. Dispatchers are bona fide agents. Dispatchers can contract with more than one broker, with more than one carrier, because they are agents and they are not employees. It states that specifically in the statute. So they're not going to refute their own statute. They're not going to refute their own findings. They're not going to refute their own rule. What they are going to do is they're going to clearly define, for those people who don't know how to read the statute, who cannot understand the legal jargon, they're going to have to dumb it down. Basically what they're going to do, they're going to dumb it down for those people that can't clearly understand it. And they're going to define, and this is what's going to hurt those freight brokers, most freight brokers out there. They're going to clearly define how you are to operate, both as a dispatcher and a freight broker. How you are to be paid, both as a dispatcher and a freight broker. The majority of dispatchers are operating correctly the right way, and they have been doing so for the last 30 years. But on the other side of it, the majority of freight brokers are stealing from owner-operators. So they're supposed to negotiate their margin on top of what the shipper has already allocated for the owner-operator. Freight brokers were put in place to assist shippers with moving their freight. Low-dollar freight, as we call cheap freight, mid-range freight, and high-dollar freight. In doing so, a freight broker they're supposed to go to a shipper and say, hey, Mr. Shipper, I see here you got $1 billion worth of freight that you need to move. Out of that $1 billion worth of freight, 65% of your freight is low-dollar freight. That's freight that's paying less than $1.50 per mile. That unattractive freight that nobody wants to run. Another 20% of your freight, 25% of your freight is mid-range freight. Freight that ranges from $2.50, $3 to about $4 per mile. And about 10% of your freight is high-dollar freight. That's the freight that's paying more than $5, $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 per mile. In order for me to move, I feel like I can help you move 30 to 40% of your freight if I can get a margin of 33 1/3% of what you would pay me to move your freight. Now, a shipper will probably come back and say, well, Mr. Broker, that's a little expensive. I can't afford to pay you 33 1/3% on top of, let's say a load is paying $3,000. I can't afford to pay you 33 1/3% on top of that $3,000. What I can afford to pay you, I can afford to pay you, let's say, around about 15%. Then the broker gets to come back and say, well, that's kind of low, considering the fact that 65% of your freight is cheap freight. And I need to help you move that freight because all freight has to move. All right, so I feel like I need a minimum of 30% in order to help you move the volume of freight that you need to move. And then shipper may come back and say, well, I could probably come up to about 25%, and then they'll probably settle on 27%, somewhere around there. So now you have a situation where you have where you negotiated, as a broker, this is where it's supposed to go. So if the shipper has loads that's paying $3,000, because you get out getting 27% margin across the board on the cheap freight, mid freight, and high dollar freight. So if the shipper now has a load that's paying $3,000 and you negotiate a 27% margin, that's 27%, that's going to give you $810 that the shipper that you have in the pot to move that freight that's paying $3,000. So in other words, you're not going to put it on the load board for $2,500. You can put it on the load board for $3,000. Or if you want to, you can take money from your margin, that $810. You can take a couple $100 or $300 or whatever you want from that margin, add it to that freight rate, and make that freight more attractive and more competitive on the load board. Y'all see how this was supposed to go? Because if they were doing that from the beginning of where they should, if brokers were operating the way they were supposed to, they wouldn't need to worry about dispatchers. Not only that, they could move cheap freight, mid-range freight, and high dollar freight, and everybody makes money, including the carrier. Why? Because let's say they got that freight, remember that cheap freight? Let's say they got a load of freight that's only paying $1.25 per mile, and it's going 900 miles. That means at $1.25 per mile times 900 miles, that means that freight is only paying $1,125. No carrier really wants to run that. Why? Because it's cheap freight. But the broker has what? 27% margin on top of that he can work with, right? So if he look at his 27% margin, he's got another $303 on that cheap freight load. But $303 is really not going to bring that freight up to a level where it's going to be really attractive. But because he negotiated that margin across the board, he can go and take some of that margin from his high dollar freight. Because remember, on that high dollar freight, on a $3,000 paying load, he's got over $800 on that load that he can work with. And if he got loads that's paying $5,000, he got more than $1,300 on those loads he can work with. So he can then reallocate some of his margin from his high dollar mid-range freight over to his low dollar freight and take some of that $303 from that 27% margin on that low dollar freight. He can add another $500, $600, or $700 to that low paying freight, which is only paying what? $1,100. Now he can add another $500 or $600 to it and make that load and make that freight $1,700. That's going 900 miles. So now when you divide that by 900, now you got 1,700 on that load, because that's what he posts on the load board for now. Divide that by the 900. Now that load is paying closer to $2 per mile, which makes it more attractive. It's not paying $125 a mile now. It's paying $188 or $190 per mile, which makes the load more attractive and allows the carrier to make their money. The broker still makes his money, and the carrier still has money left over if he has a dispatcher who has went out and found freight for him, whatever it is, we can pay his dispatcher. This is what brokers should be worried about. This is what they should be worried about. Because if the Federal Motors Carrier Association starts cracking down on brokers who are stealing money from carriers, and how many of you brokers out there are operating this way? Think about that for a second. So while you're hollering and griping and crying and complaining and slobbering about dispatchers making money and treading on your field, which they are not, you need to be concerned with how you are operating in your own backyard. Because if the Federal Motors Carrier Association start taking a closer look at how you make your money, how you've been operating, illegally stealing money from the carriers instead of negotiating your margins, game over for you. This has been a quick live from Calvin Butler, Director of the RBBS Logistics Learning Center. If you want to learn how to broker freight correctly, if you want to learn how to dispatch freight the right way, give me a call, 866-973-6445, or go to our website at theRBBSLLC.com. I'm going to give it to you straight. Peace. Y'all have a great day. Bye, everybody.